The name MGM is mostly associated with movies, but in 1987, an airline, known as MGM Grand Air, was founded by Kirk Kerkorian. The purpose of the airline, which was always pretty small, was to offer a very high-class experience, flying wealthy customers from New York to Los Angeles as well as to Las Vegas, so they could, of course, gamble at the casinos that Kerkorian owned. And while the airline did gain a reputation as a particularly good experience if you could afford it, it didn't last particularly long, and such an extravagant experience is now nothing more than a memory, at least in this context. In order to completely comprehend how this airline came into being, you have to understand the whole backstory behind its founder, Kirk Kerkorian, who was born in Fresno, California on June 6, 1917. His parents were Armenian immigrants, and they were never particularly wealthy, so he had to leave school at a young age to take odd jobs to help them get by. In his youth, he was actually a very good lightweight boxer, but he left the ring to pursue his love of flying. During World War II, he would actually serve by ferrying Canadian-built de Havilland mosquitoes over the North Atlantic Ocean to Scotland so the British RAF could use them to fight the good fight. Not exactly the most dramatic role to have in the service, but it was an essential one, so he certainly was doing his part. And this, on top of his previous experience, helped him establish a base knowledge for any and all things airplanes. When the war was over, he started purchasing surplus military airplanes, refurbishing them, and then selling them for a profit. And he was good at it, so this proved very lucrative. In 1947, he'd accumulated enough money to actually purchase an air charter service, which was called Trans-International Airlines. That charter service was designed to fly gamblers from all around the world to the gambling capital of America, Las Vegas. And it was very successful. By the 1960s, Kerkorian amassed just so much money. Enough to buy land on the Las Vegas Strip, which is absolutely not cheap. He also purchased the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer movie studio in 1969. Yes, MGM. And after he did this, he built the MGM Grand Casino, which was at the time the largest hotel globally, with more than 2,000 rooms. It was a very high-class experience that many people desired, and at this point he was a billionaire, and into the 70s and the 80s, he started wanting to get back into his roots, airplanes, and thus he wound up founding MGM Air. The airline was small, and only had a fleet of 6 planes, 3 Boeing 727s and 3 Douglas DC-8s, and the prices were oh dear. Passengers paid at least $1,400 to fly from LA to New York, and that's in 1987 money. It was $1,000 to fly between Las Vegas and New York, and $180 to fly between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. But MGM Grand Air pointed out that their ticket prices weren't that much higher than first-class fares on other airlines, and you would be getting bang for your buck because their service was far superior, and they were not bluffing on this. See, the whole point of the airline was to offer a high-class service, a high-class experience, and therefore they were trying to attract high-class, wealthy clientele. Their business model promised that each flight would never have more than 33 passengers, which already sounds luxurious as heck on the basis that, these days they cram us in like sardines, and each flight would have at least 5 flight attendants, which was kind of overkill for the amount of passengers, but they were there to offer a high-class experience. The aircraft featured contoured swivel seats, private meeting rooms, as well as gourmet food served on the finest of china. And naturally, being named after a movie studio and associated with them, they featured a selection of 6 first-run movies to watch. They had onboard VCRs and televisions for this purpose, which I know sounds dated now, but back in the 80s, that's how people watched their movies, and having them on board a plane was really cool. Plus, they offered passengers the ability to make air-to-ground telephone calls, which was considered a very high-tech thing to do back in those days, since cell phones were still over a decade away from becoming commonplace. Of course, the inside of the planes was decorated with things like gold plating and Versace fabrics. Even the toilets were designed to be as fancy as possible, and for a while it was actually kinda successful. In their good years, they were considered Hollywood's favorite way of traveling between the West and East Coast. And A-list actors like Tom Cruise, Robert De Niro, and Julia Roberts are known to have utilized the service on more than one occasion. Certainly, if you could afford it, it seems like the experience was considered worth it, but that was kind of the biggest flaw with this particular business model. See, whenever a company is catering to the ultra-rich, you have to remember that, well, they're ultra-rich. And if you're running a service that can be easily replaced by someone with enough money to do on their own privately, well, you might already see where this is going. See, the only people that could afford to fly on MGM Grand were the same people that could afford private jets. Many of MGM Grand Air's flights, especially towards the end, operated with fewer passengers on board than crew members, which was probably really great for the passengers, but you can see how the math here in terms of profits versus expenditures is not facilitating a positive gain for the company. In the 1980s, a lot of other airlines were slashing prices and cutting frills to squeeze as much money out of their flights as possible, while also offering cheaper tickets. And MGM Grand Air was still trying to appeal to the ultra-rich, but again, those ultra-rich could afford to fly in their own private planes. Why would they bother paying someone else to do it when they were so wealthy that they might as well have their own plane and staff? Then they could cater and design the interior of the plane to appeal just to them because it was theirs. Whereas with MGM, yeah, their planes were nice, you'd still have to share it with somebody. And most of Hollywood just didn't really want to do that. At no point during their existence did they ever make a profit. The only reason they got away with it for as long as they did is because they were propped up by the other businesses under the MGM name, like the casinos. Those were making money. So even if the airline was a consistent loss, it wasn't going to tank the entire corporation. They started downsizing after about 5 years, suspending their service between New York and Los Angeles and only focusing on bringing passengers to Las Vegas, which seems like the right call, since once you got them to Las Vegas, they would go to the casino, and that's where they would actually make their money, not on the planes. And by 1994, private planes had largely superseded pretty much any of their customers. And even the upper middle class couldn't afford to fly on someone like MGM, and they only had routes that went to the same place. Realizing there really wasn't a way forward for them, they decided to sell their assets to a small tour operator in Minnesota called Front Page Tours. That company provided transportation to sports teams as well as their fans, and they changed their name to Champion Air as a result. They actually managed to keep going until 2008, when they finally ceased all operations, citing high fuel costs and the inefficiency of their aging Boeing 727s that they were still using. Ultimately, MGM Grand Air is certainly an interesting story, no matter how short-lived it was. It sounds like it would have been a heck of an experience regardless, but you would have to be able to afford it, and that was always their biggest problem. Yeah, the planes were really nice, and the service was really, really nice, but really, really nice is often really, really expensive. And if you could afford really, really expensive, just buy your own plane. Just one of those things, I suppose. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Josh Johnson, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Roro Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Lord Hoff 444, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Alaric Jaspers, Tom Redlion, Ennis Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, Dr. Racer 78, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Prez Drenton, and Bradley Bowden. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.